She hadn't spoken to another human being in 11 days. Not because she was sick, not because she was afraid, but because there was no one left to speak to. The ranch sat at the end of a dirt road that didn't appear on any map. 43 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by high desert and silence so complete it had a sound of its own. And when the county truck pulled through her gate that Tuesday morning and dropped off an animal that had injured 3 handlers and destroyed 2 trailers, an unbroken, unnameable, half-wild Mustang that nobody wanted, they didn't even get out of the cab. They just opened the gate, cut the rope, and drove away. What happened next, what that horse did to her life, and what she did to that horse, is the kind of story that doesn't get told often enough. Because it didn't end the way anyone expected. It ended the way only she could have ended it. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had a moment where everything that was supposed to protect you, your family, your community, your neighbors, just walked away? And the only thing standing between you and total collapse was something wild, something broken, something that didn't speak your language at all. That's exactly where this woman found herself. If that question hit you somewhere real, drop a comment below. Tell me what city you're watching from. I read every single one. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and leave a like, because the story I'm about to tell you is going to stay with you long after it's over. Now let's go back to the beginning. Her name was Odell, not a common name. She knew that. Her mother had chosen it from an old family Bible, one of those names that belonged to a great aunt nobody quite remembered, but everybody respected from a distance. Odell had grown up thinking the name was a burden. By the time she was 61 years old and living alone on 312 acres of high desert scrubland in eastern Nevada, she had decided the name fit her perfectly. Uncommon, a little stern, easy to underestimate. She had been married to a man named Carver for 34 years. Carver had been the kind of man who knew how to fix anything. Fences, engines, pipes, silences. He wasn't much for words, but he had this quality about him, a steadiness, like a stone wall that doesn't announce itself but simply holds. They had built the ranch together from almost nothing. The main house was modest. 3 rooms, a wide porch, a kitchen that smelled permanently of coffee and mineral dust. The barn was larger than the house. Carver had always said that was the right way to do things. He died on a Thursday in March, 4 years before our story begins. Heart attack. Quick. He was out checking the far fence line, and he simply didn't come back. Odell found him near the old juniper tree at the edge of the north pasture, lying on his side as if he'd decided to rest. She buried him on the property, which required more paperwork than she'd expected, and then she got back to work. Because what else do you do? They had no children. Carver's family, a brother named Shelton and 2 nephews, had never much cared for the ranch, or for Odell specifically. They came to the funeral, ate her food, made vague noises about helping out, and then returned to their lives in Sacramento and Phoenix, respectively. Within a year, the calls had thinned to nothing. Within 2 years, Shelton had sent a certified letter suggesting she consider selling and moving somewhere more suitable for a woman alone. She did not respond to the letter. Her own family, a younger sister named Romy and a brother-in-law whose opinions Odell had never requested, lived in Reno and occasionally called on Christmas. They meant well, in the way that people who don't really understand your life mean well. They worried about her in the abstract. They sent a fruit basket once. The neighbors, a ranching family named Colquitt, about 9 miles west, had been friendly during Carver's lifetime. After his death, Harmon Colquitt came by twice with casseroles and once with an offer to buy the east pasture. When Odell declined, the visits stopped. She heard later that Harmon had told people in town she was not right, that grief had made her strange. She didn't think she was strange. She thought she was precise. The town itself, a place called Mineral Fork, population approximately 900 if you counted generously, had a small feed store, a post office, a diner called Brower's, and a volunteer fire department. Odell drove in once a month for supplies. People were polite. Nobody was warm. There was a particular quality to the politeness of people who had decided you were a lost cause, a kind of careful, pitying courtesy, like the way you speak to someone who has just received bad news and hasn't processed it yet. 4 years of that. 4 years of fixing the fences herself, of learning to operate equipment she'd only ever watched Carver use, of spending evenings reading by lamplight because the satellite internet was unreliable and she had stopped caring much about television. 4 years of mornings that arrived clean and cold and absolutely empty, and of choosing each morning to fill them herself. She had 6 chickens, 2 aging dogs named Coop and Lottie, and a small vegetable garden that produced more squash than she could ever eat. She sold eggs at the feed store once a week. That was the extent of her commerce with the human world. She was not, by any definition she recognized, a broken woman, but she was alone. And she had been alone long enough that the shape of her loneliness had changed, had hardened like something geological into something she didn't quite know how to name anymore. And then, one Tuesday morning in October, a county truck came through her gate. The horse had no name. That was the first thing she noticed, not his color, which was a dark, complicated gray shot through with black, like storm clouds pressed into muscle and bone. Not his size, which was considerable, closer to 16 hands than 15, with the broad chest and thick hindquarters of a horse that had spent years surviving rather than being kept. Not even the way he moved, which was wrong in the way that wild things moved in confined spaces. Too much attention, too much readiness, the constant low-grade calculation of an animal that had never fully trusted stillness. What she noticed first was that he had no name. The county form that had been left in her mailbox, tucked under a rock because they hadn't even stopped long enough to hand it to her, referred to him only as Asset Nugger 7 NV Mustang Unbroken. There was a case number, there was a date of capture, there was a note, almost apologetic in its bureaucratic plainness, that said, "Animal deemed unsuitable for adoption program, relocated to private land under rural placement provision, no compensation provided, no compensation provided." She stood at her gate for a long moment, reading that form. Then she folded it carefully, put it in the pocket of her work jacket, and turned to look at the horse. He was standing at the far end of her south pasture, approximately 200 feet away, facing her. His ears were forward, his nostrils were wide. He was reading her the same way she was reading him, gathering information, making calculations, deciding what kind of threat she represented. "All right," she said to no one in particular, or perhaps to him. All right. She did not approach him that day or the next. She had grown up around horses. Her father had kept 3 on a small property outside of Ely, and she had learned to ride young, learned the basic vocabulary of horses, that you approach from the front, that you let them smell you, that you never move faster than their comfort allows. But those had been domestic horses, animals that had been born into relationship with human beings and had no reason to imagine anything different. This animal had been born wild, had spent years in open country, had been captured, probably by helicopter and a small army of workers at some point in the last few years, and had apparently resisted every subsequent attempt to make him into something manageable. She knew what that resistance felt like. Not the exact shape of it. She had not been chased across open desert by strangers in a helicopter. She allowed herself that distinction. But the underlying thing, the refusal to become smaller than you actually were because the people around you found your full size inconvenient, that she understood. She began leaving water near the center of the pasture, moving the bucket a little closer each day. She spent time near the fence, not looking at him directly, just being present, reading or mending tack or doing nothing in particular, which was something she had become very good at. She spoke to him the way she sometimes spoke to herself, in the low, continuous murmur that wasn't quite conversation and wasn't quite silence. On the 4th day, he moved to within 80 feet of where she sat. On the 6th day, he took water from the bucket she'd placed 40 feet from the fence line. On the 8th day, she found him standing at the fence near the barn when she came out in the morning, watching the chickens, with what she could only describe as philosophical curiosity. She laughed at that. It had been a while since she'd laughed. Her dogs had complicated feelings about the horse. Coop, the older one, a blue heeler mix of indeterminate age who had seen everything and was impressed by nothing, watched the whole development from a safe distance and seemed to reserve judgment. Lottie, a red heeler 3 years younger and considerably more opinionated, barked at the horse once, received a look in return that apparently settled the matter permanently, and never barked at him again. Odell called the county office on the 9th day, not to complain exactly, though she had questions about the no compensation language, which seemed legally peculiar given that she hadn't exactly volunteered for this, but also because she found herself wanting to know more about him, where he'd come from, how old he was, what the 3 incidents with handlers had involved. She reached a man named Prewitt in the Animal Management Division, who sounded both overworked and vaguely embarrassed. "The Mustang from the NV7 batch," he said, when she gave him the case number. Yeah, he came out of the Pine Nut Range originally, estimated 6 to 8 years old. The handler incidents? Look, he didn't actually hurt anyone badly, it's just that he's big, Odell offered. Perceptive, Prewitt said. That's the word our trainer used. She said he was the most perceptive horse she'd worked with in 20 years, and that was the problem. He knew exactly what was being done to him, and he refused to accept it. A pause. She wasn't wrong. He's not mean. He's not dangerous in the way a genuinely dangerous horse is dangerous. He doesn't agree. Odell was quiet for a moment. What happened to the trainer, she asked. She quit, not because of him specifically, but he was the last straw, I think. She'd been doing it a long time. After she hung up, Odell went back out to the pasture. The horse was grazing near the center, unhurried, the afternoon light catching the complicated gray of his coat and turning it briefly silver. She decided to call him Theorem, not because it was a horse name. It wasn't. But it felt right for an animal whose whole existence seemed to pose a question that kept demanding a better answer. She didn't know yet that within 3 months, Theorem would change everything. She didn't know that he would bring people to her gate. Strangers, then neighbors, then someone from a long time ago she hadn't expected to see again. She didn't know that what began as an unwanted animal dropped on her land by a bureaucracy that had run out of options would become the center of something larger than her solitude. Something that would require her, finally, to decide what kind of woman she intended to be in whatever years she had left. She just knew that he didn't agree. And she found that, for the first time in 4 years, neither did she. The first person to come through her gate because of Theorem was a woman named Blith. Not Blythe. Blythe, she was particular about the spelling, which Odell learned within approximately 4 minutes of meeting her. She arrived on a Saturday morning in late October, driving a truck that was newer than anything Odell had seen on her property in recent memory, and she pulled up to the house with the particular confidence of a person who had decided in advance to be welcomed. She was younger than Odell by perhaps 20 years, with the lean, weathered look of someone who spent serious time outdoors, and she introduced herself as a wildlife horse advocate with a non-profit based in Reno. "I heard through the county office that you'd taken in the NV7 Mustang," she said. "I hope that's not too forward. Prewitt mentioned your name." Odell regarded her from the porch. "Prewitt talked to you about my horse. He talks to everyone about everything. It's his defining quality." Blith had an easy smile, not pushy, just present. "I've been tracking that particular horse for about 2 years. We flagged him during the roundup. He was part of a small band, family group actually. He was the lead stallion." She paused. "We tried to get him into a protected sanctuary placement, but the paperwork got complicated, and he ended up in the adoption program, which was clearly wrong for him from the start. And now he's here," Odell said. "And now he's here." Blith tilted her head. "How is he?" Something in the straightforwardness of the question, no preamble, no performance of concern, just genuine wanting to know, made Odell step down off the porch. "Come see," she said. They walked to the pasture fence together. Theorem was at the far end, but as Odell approached, he lifted his head and turned, not with alarm, but with recognition. He walked, unhurried, toward the fence. Blythe was quiet for a long moment. "You've been doing join-up work," she said finally. It wasn't quite a question. "I've been sitting with him," Odell said. "I don't know what you'd call it. I'd call it join-up work, or something very close to it. That horse." She gestured toward Theorem, who was now standing 12 feet away, regarding them both with calm attention. "That horse took 3 weeks and 4 experienced handlers before he'd allow human proximity at the training facility. You've had him 10 days? 11. Blythe looked at her for a long moment. "What did you do?" "Nothing," Odell said. "And then, because that wasn't quite accurate, I stopped trying to do anything. I was there. I let him decide the pace." "That sounds like everything," Blythe said quietly. They stood at the fence for another half hour. Blythe asked careful questions, the kind that didn't presume answers. She didn't offer advice. She didn't suggest improvements. She just listened and observed and occasionally asked something else. Before she left, she mentioned that her organization, she called it the High Basin Horse Project, had been trying for years to establish what she called a gentling demonstration program. Not training, she was careful about the word, gentling. The distinction, she explained, mattered enormously. Training implied bringing an animal into compliance with human expectations. Gentling implied something mutual, a negotiation, a gradual establishment of trust between two kinds of intelligence that didn't share a language but could, given patience and honesty, find common ground. "We've had trouble finding the right location," she said. "The right environment. Most facilities are too institutional. The horses feel it, and most private landowners don't have the temperament for this kind of slow work." She didn't say anything else about it. She thanked Odell, gave her a card, and drove away. Odell stood on her porch for a long time after the truck disappeared down the dirt road. Then she went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, looking at the card, which said only Blythe Arden, High Basin Horse Project, and a phone number. She put the card on the windowsill above the sink, where she could see it every morning. 3 days later, Harmon Colquitt came down her road for the first time in nearly 2 years. He stood at the gate and did not open it, which she noted. She went out to meet him. He was a heavy-set man in his 60s, with the particular expression of someone who has prepared a speech and is now uncertain whether to deliver it. "Heard you got one of those county Mustangs," he said. "Word travels. Mineral Fork has a limited supply of news." He looked past her toward the south pasture, where Theorem was visible. "That's a big animal." "He is." A silence. Harmon cleared his throat. "Greta," he said, and his wife. "Greta wanted me to ask if you needed any help. Feed, supplies, whatever." Odell looked at him steadily. "What changed, Harmon?" He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I beg your pardon? You haven't been down this road in almost 2 years. You told people in town I wasn't right. And now Greta sends you to ask if I need supplies." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with what seemed like genuine discomfort, "I might have misjudged the situation. When you declined the pasture offer, I took it personally. I shouldn't have. It wasn't much of an apology. It wasn't quite nothing either." "Tell Greta thank you," Odell said. "I'm all right for now, but if that changes, I'll let you know." He nodded, looked once more at Theorem, and left. She stood at her gate long enough to watch his truck reach the main road. Then she turned and walked back toward the pasture, where Theorem stood at the fence watching her approach, and she put her hand, flat-palmed, on the warm, solid rail of his neck, and he didn't move away. Small things. They accumulate. November arrived with a cold front that knocked temperatures down 20 degrees in a single day and brought the kind of wind that got inside the barn, no matter how carefully you'd repaired the boards. Odell worked 12-hour days that month. There was always maintenance that Carver had kept up and that she had been managing increasingly alone. A section of roof on the barn that needed new tin, a water line to the south pasture that had developed a slow leak, winter preparations for the chicken coop that involved more insulation and ingenuity than she'd had to deploy the previous 2 years. She worked, and Theorem watched. He had developed a habit of positioning himself wherever she was working, not close enough to interfere, but near enough to observe. She would be 40 feet up a ladder, nailing tin, and look down to find him standing below, head slightly tilted, following her movements with his dark, serious eyes. She began narrating her work to him, explaining in a low, conversational tone what she was doing and why, as if he were an apprentice she was training. She couldn't have said when this started feeling completely natural. Blythe came back twice in November. She brought a colleague the second time, a younger man named Stave, quiet and observant, who filmed Theorem from the fence line with a small camera and said very little. Odell made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table and talked. And she realized, somewhere in the middle of the second visit, that she had been hungry for exactly this. Not just company, but specific company. People who cared about something and talked about it directly, who didn't perform concern or offer vague comforts, but just engaged plainly with the actual substance of things. Blythe had started bringing Odell books, Animal Behavior, Ethology, a fascinating book by a researcher named Maguire. She referred to the author, and Odell gathered it up herself at the post office when it arrived, about the social and emotional lives of wild horses. Odell read in the evenings with Coop at her feet and Lottie asleep by the wood stove, and found herself understanding Theorem differently with each chapter, the way you understand a person differently when you learn more of their history. He had been part of a band, a family. He had been the lead stallion, which meant she learned not just the dominant male, but the primary protector, the animal most responsible for navigating the band through danger and towards safety. It was an enormous responsibility for a creature with no capacity for abstraction, operating entirely on instinct and experience and whatever the equine equivalent of wisdom was. Then the helicopters came. The band scattered. He was captured, separated from everything familiar, and introduced to a world that made no sense and offered no safety, and kept trying to turn him into something he wasn't. No wonder he didn't agree. It was in this context that Odell received on a grey Wednesday afternoon in mid-November a phone call from Carver's brother, Shelton. She almost didn't answer. She saw the California number and held the phone for 3 full rings, weighing it. Odell. His voice had the careful quality it always had with her, not quite hostile, not quite warm, navigating some permanent uncertainty about whether she was an adversary or a burden. "I heard you're keeping a wild horse out there." "News really does travel," she said. "I talked to Harmon Colquitt. He was in Sacramento for we have mutual acquaintances." A pause. "Odell, I want to say something, and I want you to let me say it before you respond." "Go ahead." "I've been thinking about Carver, about how things went after he passed. I didn't handle it well. The letter I sent, the distance. I think I told myself it was practical concern, and it was probably more complicated than that." Another pause. "I think I was angry that he chose that life and left me alone with the family after our parents died. And I took some of that out on his wife because she was there and he wasn't, and that was wrong." Odell sat down at the kitchen table. Through the window, she could see the edge of the south pasture. "That's more self-awareness than I expected from you, Shelton," she said finally. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "I've been seeing someone, a therapist. She's rigorous. Good for her. I wanted to say it. I'm not calling to get anything. I'm not calling about the property. I'm calling to say that Carver loved that place and he loved you, and I let my own grief make me stupid and small, and I'm sorry." She didn't say anything for a moment. "All right," she said. "I hear you. That's all I'm asking for right now." After she hung up, she sat at the table for a long time. Grief was strange. It didn't move in straight lines. It moved the way Theorem moved. Sometimes toward you, sometimes away, always on its own schedule, indifferent to your preferences. She thought about Carver, about the way he used to come in from the north pasture in the evenings with dust in his hair and that particular quietness on him, the quietness of a man who had spent a day doing what he was built for and was satisfied, about how she had never once, in 34 years, taken that quietness for granted. She went out to the pasture. Theorem came to her, not to the fence. He came all the way across the pasture and stopped 3 feet away, and she stood very still, and after a moment, he extended his nose toward her hand. She felt the warm breath of him against her palm. "I know," she said, to Carver, to Theorem, to herself, to all of it. The town of Mineral Fork discovered Theorem in December. It started, as most things started there, with the feed store. Odell had come in for her monthly supplies and mentioned, briefly, not intending anything by it, that the county Mustang was settling well. The feed store owner, a genial man named Orvis, who had worked that counter for 30 years and had a gift for amplifying information, apparently mentioned it to several people who mentioned it to several others. By the second week of December, she had received 3 visitors she hadn't expected. The first was a girl, 14 or 15, who appeared at her gate on a Saturday morning on a bicycle that had no business on that dirt road and introduced herself as Lacey. She said, with the directness of a teenager who had not yet learned to disguise her desires, that she had heard there was a wild Mustang on the property and that she was very serious about horses, and could she please see him. Odell looked at her for a long moment. Then she opened the gate. She didn't let Lacey into the pasture. That was a boundary she maintained carefully, understanding that Theorem's trust was a particular and specific thing, not transferable on demand. But she let her stand at the fence, and she explained, in the same precise way she explained things to Theorem, what she had learned and how she had learned it. Lacey listened with the focused attention of someone who has found the subject they were built for and knows it immediately. "How do you know when he's comfortable?" Lacey asked. "He tells you," Odell said, "not in language, but he tells you. You just have to stop talking long enough to listen." Lacey came back 4 times that month. She started bringing apples. Theorem, who had no particular history with apples, regarded the first one with deep suspicion, and the second one with tentative interest, and the third one with an enthusiasm he tried to make look dignified. The second unexpected visitor was the diner owner, a thin, restless woman named Vance, who ran Brower's and who Odell had exchanged perhaps 40 words with over 4 years of monthly supply runs. She brought a casserole, which she offered with the slightly awkward air of someone who had rehearsed a different opening line and abandoned it. "I heard you've been out here alone since Carver passed," Vance said. "That's a long time." "It is," Odell said. "I should have come sooner." She said it plainly, without the performance of guilt, which Odell found she respected. "I should have come sooner, and I didn't because it was easier not to. And that's the truth of it." Odell took the casserole. "Come see the horse," she said. The third visitor was the most complicated. His name was Radford, and she hadn't seen him in nearly 30 years. He had been Carver's closest friend in their 20s. They had grown up together in the same small town east of Ely, had served in the same National Guard unit, had stayed close through their 30s before life pulled them different directions. He had married, had children, had moved to Idaho, had exchanged Christmas cards with Carver, until somewhere around year 20 of Odell's marriage, when the cards had simply stopped. He was in his late 60s now, with white hair and the slightly bewildered expression of a man who had driven a long way and was not entirely certain he'd made the right decision. He had heard about Theorem through his daughter, who followed the High Basin Horse Project on social media and had seen a post Blith had made, careful, not naming the ranch or Odell, but describing a remarkable example of intuitive gentling work happening on private land in eastern Nevada. His daughter had mentioned it. He had connected the dots. "I almost didn't come," he said. He was standing at her gate, hat in his hands, in the early morning light of a cold December day. "I went back and forth about it for 3 weeks." "What decided it?" she asked. "I owed Carver a better accounting than I gave him while he was alive," Radford said. "I let that friendship go for no good reason. Inertia, self-absorption, the usual." He looked at her steadily. "I figured if I couldn't make it right with him, I could at least come and look you in the eye and say I'm sorry he's gone, because he was the best man I knew for a long stretch of years, and I acted like that was just a given, like it would always be there." Odell stood on her porch for a long moment. She thought about all the people who had let distance accumulate. Shelton, Harmon, the town in general, Radford. She thought about how grief could make other people's discomfort into abandonment, and she thought about how she had accepted that abandonment as simply the way things were, as the geological inevitability of being a woman alone on a remote ranch. She thought about Theorem and about the difference between a horse that had been abandoned and a horse that had simply not yet been given adequate reason to trust. "Come in," she said. "I'll make coffee." He came in. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she had sat with Blythe, where she had taken Shelton's call, where she had spent 4 years of evenings alone with her books. And they talked about Carver for 2 hours. Not about his death, about his life. About the young man Radford had known, the one she had only met later, the irreverent, stubborn, funny 25-year-old who had apparently once argued with a commanding officer about the correct way to repair a truck and been entirely right about it. She listened to stories she hadn't known. She told stories he hadn't known. She laughed 3 times, hard enough that Coop lifted his head from the floor in alarm. Afterward, she took Radford to the pasture fence. Theorem came across the field with his measured, serious walk and stopped at the fence and looked at Radford with the same focused attention he gave everything. "Lord," Radford said softly. "He's something." "He is," Odell agreed. That evening, after Radford had gone, she stood at the fence alone in the December dark. The stars over the high desert were remarkable. She had never stopped noticing that, not in all the years of solitude, not once. Theorem stood nearby, visible as a darker shape against the dark. She had a thought that she would not have had 6 months earlier. Something was beginning, not ending, beginning. And she was not, she realized, afraid of it. January brought the storm. It came on a Thursday night, a front that the Weather Service had tracked but not quite predicted in its full intensity. 3 inches of ice, followed by 14 inches of snow, temperatures dropping to 11 below zero, winds at 40 miles per hour sustained, 60 in gusts. The power went out at 9 in the evening. Odell had backup. She always had backup. She had lived in this country long enough to know that the grid was a suggestion. But the backup ran the house, not the barn. At midnight, she put on every layer she owned and went out to Theorem. She had a lantern. The distance from the house to the barn was 80 feet of compacted, ice-slicked ground that required careful navigation in full wind. She made it in about 3 minutes that felt considerably longer. Inside the barn, the temperature was survivable. The structure was old but solid. The hay provided insulation, and the simple fact of Theorem's body heat was not insignificant. He was standing in the center of the space, which was not where she had put him. She had left him in the near stall, but the stall door, old hardware, she had been meaning to replace the latch for 2 years, had apparently come open. He could have been anywhere in the barn. He was standing in the center of it, and when she came through the door, he turned to her immediately. She stayed with him for 2 hours. She brought a blanket and a headlamp and the book she'd been reading, and she sat on the old hay bales at the far end of the barn, and Theorem stood near her, and she read out loud because the wind against the barn walls was loud, and reading out loud helped her ignore it. She read 3 chapters of a book about soil ecology that she had found at the post office exchange box, which was not what she would have chosen, but was what she had, and she read it to Theorem in the same low, steady voice she always used, and he stood and listened. Around 2 in the morning, he lay down. Horses don't lie down in the presence of humans unless they feel safe. She knew this. She had read it, and she had been told it by Blythe, and she had understood it intellectually, but the physical reality of it, this enormous, complicated, mistrustful animal lowering himself to the ground 6 feet from where she sat, was something different from understanding. She sat very still. He sighed a long exhalation that she felt in her own chest somehow, and closed his eyes. She sat with him in the lantern light while the storm worked on the barn walls and the temperature kept dropping, and she thought about Carver, and about her father's 3 horses, and about the 34 years of mornings that had seemed ordinary while they were happening, and were revealed as extraordinary only in their absence, and about the 4 years of replacing all of that with solitude and discipline, and the daily practice of being sufficient to herself. She had been sufficient. She wanted to be clear about that, even to herself, even in the privacy of her own thinking. She had not been diminished by the years alone. She had not been simply waiting. She had been living, differently than before, at a register that the people around her had mistaken for diminishment because they didn't recognize it, but living fully, on her own terms, in the way she understood herself. But she also thought, sitting in the barn with the sleeping horse and the storm and the cold and the lantern, that sufficiency and flourishing were not the same thing, that she had been sufficient without being connected, and that she had tolerated the absence of connection by redescribing it as chosen, as strength, as the appropriate posture of a woman who had loved and lost and was not going to perform need for an audience that wasn't there anyway. Theorem had not performed need either. He had not whinnied at the fence for attention, or followed handlers around for treats, or done any of the things that would have made him easy and adoptable and palatable. He had simply been what he was, fully, without apology, and had trusted that eventually the right situation would find him. She wasn't sure the comparison was entirely fair to either of them. But in the lantern light, in the January storm, with 6 feet of dark horse breathing slowly in the hay, she decided that she was going to call Blythe in the morning and say yes. Blythe had come back in December with a formal proposal. The High Basin Horse Project wanted to establish a gentling demonstration center, a place where a rotating group of wild horses could be placed with careful, experienced handlers, where the process of building trust could be documented and taught and witnessed by the ranchers and land managers and school groups and journalists who had started asking questions about the Mustang program. They had funding. They had a plan. They needed land, specifically the kind of land that already had the right infrastructure and the right person. She had told Blythe she would think about it. She had been thinking about it for 3 weeks. What stopped her was not uncertainty about the work. She understood the work. She had been doing the work for 3 months without calling it anything official. What stopped her was the same thing that had been stopping her for 4 years, the deep-grooved habit of protecting herself from the particular pain of being disappointed by other people. If she said yes and it failed, if she opened her property and her gate and her particular quality of patience to other people, and they left, if she became something other than sufficient and self-contained, and it turned out not to be worth it. But Theorem was breathing 6 feet away, in the January dark, trusting her enough to sleep. She thought about what she had said to Lacey. You have to stop talking long enough to listen. She had been talking to herself for 4 years. The same story on repeat, well constructed and internally consistent, that she was fine, that she was strong, that she had everything she needed, that the people who had walked away had done her the favor of clarifying what she could and couldn't count on. A good story, a true story in parts. But Theorem had a story too, an animal that had been captured against his will and handled badly, and failed by the people responsible for him. An animal with what Prewitt's trainer had called a refusal to become something smaller than he was. He had not let that story become the whole story. He had remained open, not to everything, not to everyone, but to the possibility that the right circumstances, given enough time and patience, would eventually present themselves. She stayed in the barn until the storm eased, near dawn. Then she went inside, made coffee, and waited for a reasonable hour to call. At 7:30, she called Blythe. Yes, she said when Blythe answered. I've been thinking about the proposal. The answer is yes. A pause. Then Blythe said quietly, What changed? Odell looked out the kitchen window at the snow-covered pasture, just beginning to catch the pale winter light. I stopped talking long enough to listen, she said. Spring came slowly that year, the way it always did in the high desert, not as an arrival, so much as a gradual atmospheric negotiation. the cold seeding ground inch by inch, the days lengthening almost imperceptibly, the scrubland returning from grey to something that wasn't quite green, but was heading in that direction. By March, the High Basin Horse Project had placed 3 additional horses on Odell's property, all Mustangs from the adoption program, all carrying their own specific histories of wildness and wariness. Blythe coordinated the logistics. Stave came out twice a week to document. A researcher from the University of Nevada named Dr. Sefton began making monthly visits, collecting data on the gentling process that she was incorporating into a study on horse-human trust formation. Lacey came every Saturday without exception and had begun to assist with the younger horses under Odell's supervision. Her parents, a quiet couple named Rin and Dal, who drove her out each week and waited in the truck, had, by the 3rd visit, started getting out of the truck and asking questions. By May, Dal was helping Odell with fence maintenance, purely because he had the skills and it needed doing, and he was there. Small things, accumulating. Harmon Colquitt began stopping by, irregularly but genuinely, with feed supplies, and occasionally with his wife Greta, who had made the casserole back when Carver died and had apparently felt guilty about the subsequent silence for 4 years, and expressed this guilt through the medium of extraordinary baked goods. Odell was not opposed to extraordinary baked goods. Vance from the diner started sending people out on Sundays, not formally, nothing organized, just mentioning to customers who expressed interest that there was something worth seeing on the old Carver place if they wanted a drive and didn't mind a dirt road. People came. Odell let them stand at the fence. She explained things in the same low, careful voice she used with the horses themselves, what trust looked like, what it required, why it couldn't be rushed, what it meant to be the kind of presence that another creature could choose, freely, to move toward. Theorem remained the center of all of it. Not because she favored him. She was careful about that, about distributing her attention equitably among all 4 horses, but because he had been first, and because the people who came understood instinctively that his story was the origin of what they were witnessing. The big grey horse who hadn't agreed, who had been left at a gate by people who had run out of options and had turned out to be exactly what one particular woman had needed, and who had apparently felt the same way about her. Shelton came to visit in April. He was quieter than she remembered, less defended, with the slightly unguarded quality of a man who had been doing honest work on himself and was neither proud of the necessity nor ashamed of it. They walked the property together, and she showed him what Carver had built, not to make him feel the guilt of his absence, but because she had found that she wanted someone from Carver's blood to see it, to understand what Carver had been when he was at his best. Shelton stood at the fence with his hands in his pockets and watched Theorem for a long time. He would have loved this, Shelton said. Carver would have loved this whole thing. I know, Odell said. Radford came back too, twice in the spring, once with his daughter who was 24 and worked in environmental consulting, and who asked excellent questions and took careful notes and looked at Theorem the way people looked at things that clarified something for them. None of this was a revolution. None of it arrived with drama or declaration. It was the steady, patient accumulation of connection, the same process she had used with Theorem, applied somewhat reluctantly and then with growing intention to human beings. She was not the person she had been 4 years earlier. She was not honestly the person she had been a year earlier. She was something that included all of those versions and had added something new. Not vulnerability exactly, because she had always been capable of vulnerability. She had just been hoarding it. More like porousness, a willingness to be changed by what came through her gate. In May, she found herself thinking one morning, over coffee, with Coop at her feet, and Lottie asleep by the stove and the kitchen filling with pale spring light, that she was not merely sufficient. She was, in fact, happy. She sat with that for a moment. It felt accurate, it felt earned. It felt like something Carver would have looked at with his quiet satisfaction and said simply, "There it is." A year and a half after Theorem arrived at her gate, Odell received a letter. It came from a woman she had never met, a retired schoolteacher named Winslate, living in a small town in Wyoming, who had seen a short documentary segment about the High Basin Horse Project that had aired on a regional PBS affiliate. The segment had featured the ranch, had shown Theorem and the other horses, had included a brief interview with Odell in which she had said very little that was quotable, but had stood at the fence with her hand on Theorem's neck and looked, in Stave's careful framing, like a woman who had found the exact coordinates of herself. Winslate's letter was 4 pages, handwritten in the careful script of someone who had spent decades writing on chalkboards. She was 73. She had been widowed 6 years earlier. She lived on 12 acres outside a small town with 2 dogs and a garden, and she had been, she wrote, living at what she called half capacity since her husband's death, not in crisis, not in dramatic grief, but in a kind of sustained dimness, as if someone had turned down the lights slightly and she had simply adjusted her expectations to the available level. She had watched the segment 3 times. "I don't know exactly what I'm writing to tell you," Winsley wrote near the end of the letter. "I suppose I'm writing to say that I recognized you. Not personally, I don't know you, but I recognized the particular kind of woman you appear to be, and the particular kind of life you appear to have been living, and the particular change that seems to have happened. And I wanted to tell someone who would understand that I am going to stop adjusting my expectations. I have a neighbor who keeps horses and has been asking me for 2 years to come and spend time with them. And I have been saying maybe, and I'm going to call her tomorrow morning and say yes." Odell read the letter twice. Then she sat at the kitchen table and wrote back, 4 pages of her own, in her plain, deliberate handwriting. She told Winslate about Carver, about the 4 years, about Theorem arriving at the gate. She told her about Blythe and Lacey and Radford and Shelton and Vance and all the small accumulations. She told her about the night in the barn, the storm, the sleeping horse, the lantern light. She wrote, "I think the thing I had to learn is that being sufficient to yourself is real and valuable and not nothing, but it is also not the same as being open. And I confused them for a long time, because openness had cost me things, and I had decided, without quite deciding it, that I was done paying that particular cost. What I didn't understand was that I was paying a different cost the whole time, a quieter one that doesn't announce itself. You just wake up one day and realize you've been living at half capacity, as you put it, for long enough that you'd stopped noticing the difference. Call your neighbor, go see the horses, not because it will fix anything, but because some things don't get fixed. They just get inhabited differently, and differently is enough to start with." She mailed the letter on a Tuesday morning, same day she went to the feed store in Mineral Fork. Orvis asked how the horses were doing. She told him specifically in some detail, and he listened with the particular attentiveness of a man who had finally been given something worth listening to. Theorem was 8 years old by then, the middle of a horse's life, in the best years of a horse's life, past the alarm and wariness of youth, but not yet into the slower, more philosophical pace of age. He was not tame. She wanted to be precise about that. He was not domesticated in the way of horses bred to accommodation. He was still in some fundamental register wild, still operating according to his own internal calendar, still reserving the right to disagree, still in possession of a self-determination that she found, if anything, more impressive the longer she knew him. But he came to her every morning, in the pale, high desert light, when she walked out to the pasture with the first coffee of the day. He came across the field to meet her, not at a run, at his own pace, but toward her deliberately, choosing it. She thought about that most mornings, about what it meant to choose something you didn't have to choose, about the particular dignity of trust that is given rather than extracted, about the Tuesday in October when a county truck had come through her gate and dropped something impossible and irreplaceable at her feet and driven away. She was grateful to them, she supposed, in the way you are grateful for accidents that turn out to be exactly what you needed, in the way you are grateful for the things that happen when everyone else has already left. There's something I want to leave you with before we close. Odell didn't set out to rebuild her life. She wasn't following a plan or working through a framework or taking steps in any prescribed order. She was just doing the next thing, feeding the horses, mending the fence, sitting at the fence, making coffee, reading by lamplight, choosing every morning to be present to whatever the day brought. And the day brought a wild horse, and the wild horse brought Blith, and Blith brought visibility, and visibility brought Lacey and Vance, and Radford and Shelton, and eventually Winsley's letter, and eventually whatever comes after Winsley's letter, which Odell would tell you she doesn't need to know in advance. What strikes me about this story is the patience of it. Not passive patience, not resignation, not simply enduring, but active, intentional patience. The decision to let things move at their own pace and to trust that pace without trying to accelerate it. She didn't change the horse. She didn't fix him. She created the conditions in which he could choose something different from what he'd chosen before. And in doing that for him, she had to practice it herself, had to become, gradually and without fanfare, the kind of person who stood at her own gate and said yes to what showed up, instead of regulating everything that came in. If you're watching this from somewhere that feels like that south pasture, wide, quiet, a little empty, the horizon a long way off, I want you to know that the horse is coming. Not on your schedule, not the way you expected, maybe not looking like anything you recognize, but it's coming. And when it gets to the fence, don't move too fast. Just be there. Let it decide the pace. That's usually enough to start. If this story reached you today, let me know in the comments. Tell me your city. Tell me what part of it landed for you. I read everything. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because we've got more stories like this one coming, and you don't want to miss them. Take care of yourselves. We'll talk soon.